Alrighty, folks. So we are finishing up chapter 5. Today, and hold on here. There we go. Finishing up chapter 5 here today, and talking about ecosystems and the organisms. We're focusing a lot on the organisms today. So, I'm going to talk about some divisions of life, some of which we touched on in the past. We've got two primary branches of things that are alive, two versions. The prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. Okay? And I purposely put that capital K in there to show you, that part of that word remains the same. And what we're looking at is just a difference in essentially a prefix here. What does the prefix pro mean? It has a couple different uses modern day, but we've come to associate it with professional, which isn't what we're going for here. What's the other use? Positive. All right. Pros and cons. Very good. I'm looking for more like prototype, protozoa. Okay. So it actually means earlier first as well. So this is interesting. I like learning about bits and pieces of words, and I forgot about what he mentioned for pro. So yeah, this is one of those where it's got a lot of different modern meanings. But in this case, we're talking about protozoa, the first critters. And you in this case means true, as you'll see in a moment. So the real question boils down to is then what does karyotic mean? And we'll get there. So prokaryotes lack organelles. Eukaryotes have organelles. What the heck is an organelle? All right. Somebody want to add to that? All right. Parts of your cells that have specialized functions. Does anybody remember one or two from bio class? Yep, good. So we remember a couple. My favorite to say, I couldn't tell you what it did if I had to save my soul, was Golgi apparatus, or Golgi bodies, I think they call it nowadays. It's like saying Golgi. But yeah, mitochondria, chloroplasts, I think vacuoles were in there. There were a whole bunch of different little pieces, parts in cells. Oh yeah, ribosomes, very good. Oh, God, smooth ER and endoplasmic reticulum. There you go. It's been a while since I taught Bio 101. But, yeah. And it's really cool because when you look at a cell at that level, it's kind of like a city, all right? And you've got the boundary around it, the cell wall. They always say only plants have cell walls, but the cell membrane, whatever you want to call it, which is only marginally a biology class, right? So you've got your cell membrane, and within that cell membrane, you got one of two options. You either have very defined little locations. This is the butchers, this is the bakers, this is the candlestick makers. Or you got everybody running around willy-nilly inside of that cell wall, all right? And prokaryotes is kind of like that last choice. There's no clear division of what's going on inside. There's, ideally, a lot of the same functions being taken care of, but it's not organized. But with the organelles, you have that division of labor. You have that true organization. All right. Prokaryotes also lack a nucleus, where the eukaryotes have a nucleus. What's a nucleus?
The control center of a cell would basically be the city hall.
There you go, to carry out my little town conversation there. Excellent. All right. It's the center of the cell. And We'll learn a little bit more about that, I think. So again, it follows up with the not very organized. Okay. And then we go to find out that prokaryotes are bacteria and eukaryotes are everything else. Higher life forms, as they like to say. I think that's a little, I don't know, life formist of us. But, we're the higher life forms. So, all right. So basic divisions, prokaryote, eukaryote. As you can imagine, we're going to split, at the very least, eukaryotes up. So we talked about briefly domains the other day. I mentioned to you guys that when I was in school, we didn't use the word domains. We certainly had prokaryote, eukaryote. We talked about bacteria, okay, but we had archaea, but bacteria weren't truly split into these two groups yet. Archaebacteria were under still Monera, which I get is, like I said the other day, is an antiquated term. That was a bacteria. So now we have archaea and bacteria as prokaryotes. All right. And the archaea, that's the archaebacteria. You know those as extremophiles, the critters that live deep inside of a volcano, inside of a volcano, deep inside of a mile down in ice. And believe it or not, stuff lives there. Okay?
Or
Deep at the bottom of the ocean, at the surface of Mars. Well, we'll see about that. But so these guys are in situations where we wouldn't typically think life would exist. Those are the extremophiles. All right? And then just bacteria, eubacteria. Again, the prefix eu means true. These are everywhere. Bless their hearts. They manage to thrive and survive in almost every condition. And I won't get into this whole struggle that we're doing with this antibiotic this and antibiotic that, and how we're breeding the super bacteria that are resistant to this and resistant to that. You've heard about that in the news. It is true, okay, but again, that's for a different class. And then the eukaryotes, the eukarya. So, by the way, when you see a different ending, we always have to do this in historical geology when I get into talking about all the scientific names for the critters. Okay? Saying eukarya versus eukaryotic versus eukaryotes, we're talking about the same thing. It's just a different way of conjugating it, okay? I know most of you know that, but for those of you that don't quite have all the sciences behind you, if 3/4 of the word is the same, you can be pretty assured that we're talking about, something to do with that critter. All right. It's just we conjugate it differently. Sometime we're referring to one versus two. Sometime we're referring to like a y'all kind of thing. So it's the same thing. All right, 6 kingdoms. Archaea and bacteria we just talked about. We got the protistas. And this one gets its name changed periodically as well. And I'm not even sure if protista is still what they're using. But the protists, at any rate. These are very, very basic organisms. But they are eukaryotes. Okay? So they've got the cell structure and all that set up with them. The fungi, however you want to say it. Plantae. AE is pronounced A. And Animalia. So anything and everything that's alive can fit into one of these 6 categories, which we call kingdoms. All right? So we moved down a notch from domain to kingdoms. And then I gave you my little mnemonic the other day. Kings play chess on funny green stools. To help you remember it. So kings play, next is P, remember that's phylum. C stands for class, so on and so forth. We'll show you that whole list, but just a heads up, that's the direction we're going here. And please don't worry, you're not going to have to remember the phyla. There's a gajillion of them. Don't start stressing about that. But you might want to spend some time remembering the kingdoms. Haven't made that quiz yet, so I don't quite remember the detail of questions in there, but I have to imagine I asked that. So we're going to talk about these each a little bit. Kingdom Protista. These are your unicellular or very simple multicellular. And I stopped myself a moment ago. I don't know if you caught it. I started to say single-celled organisms. I'm like, I think there's a little more in there. And so there are some very simple multicellular stuff. Who do you got in here? You've got the algae. Algae are not plants. A lot of people think they're plants. Algae are not plants. Protozoans. Slime and water molds. Everybody's favorite, of course. Protozoans, radiolarians, hydra, some of the stuff they always show you in bio in high school. There's another one that's jumped out of my brain. Very common. Diatoms is floating around, but I want to say diatoms are single-celled plants. I don't do tiny, tiny, tiny critters. I do vertebrates. But so these really tiny things that end up floating around in your water, stuff you're not supposed to, drink. Looks like a cool mountain stream, but it's actually full of all kind of stuff that'll really hurt you. That's these guys. Protozoans. And again, proto, earlier first, zoa, life. All right. So that's what they were going for there. They were, wrong, but we kept the name. The bacteria were first. Fungi. All right. Mushrooms, yeasts, and molds. And yeah, I know we said slime and water molds over here. I am not a mycologist. And everyone learned that word recently watching that wonderful show on HBO. A mycologist is someone who studies molds and fungi. So yeast is a fungus. A lot of people don't know that one. So your beers and whatnot, you guys aren't old enough yet, I'm sure. One of these days you'll have a beer, though. That's made with a fungus we call yeast. Mushrooms. And as we said, mold itself. Plantae, hopefully I don't have to tell you what plants are. Animalia, similarly. So out of these 6 kingdoms, where do we fall? Animalia, cool. All right. So we are indeed animals. Very loosely, but... We mentioned a branching structure as evidence for evolution. This is a very simple version of that branch. All right. And it shows really that we're actually a little more closely related to archaea than we are to other bacteria. I mentioned to you that blue-green bacteria were supposedly the first organisms on the planet. All right, so that is down with that common ancestor of all organisms. And even though we just spent a wonderful couple days talking about evolution in here, I do know it is a lot to swallow to follow this line from stuff that you slip on in a stream and rocks and curse at it to, well, us. Okay? Suffice it to say that there was a lot of time in between, a couple billion years, actually. So, lots and lots and lots of time. All right, so we're switching gears, and you guys are probably, not a one of you even know who this guy is, right? That's all right. It was old even when I was young. It's a guy from Monty Python. he was very famous for saying, and now for something completely different, and they'd switch scenes. It's kind of like the 3 minutes later in SpongeBob kind of thing. I should probably switch to that now. But I can't do a bad French accent very well, so. All right. Interactions between organisms. You guys go through interactions every moment of every day. Typically, you think about the organisms that are most similar to you. All right? Interactions between classmates, coworkers, family members. That's at the same species level. Switching gears, thinking like that now, okay? There are also many other interactions that you're unaware of. Maybe some of you are aware of them or not. It varies. You've got mice sneaking into your house, constantly eating some of your grain or something like that. You've got weeds that you're trying every year to kill in your garden, and they keep coming back. You've got a cold that you're fighting, an infection that you're fighting. Those are all kinds of interactions between different types of organisms. Okay? Well, it turns out that those can be classified into 5 basic categories. You've got symbiosis, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and predation. And of course, we will talk about each of those. Some of you still writing that list down, so I'll give you a moment more. All right, symbiosis. A symbiosis is any intimate relationship or association between members of 2 or more species. We misuse this word a little bit in conversation. I'm guilty of it myself. All right, in that we always refer to symbiosis. We tend to refer to symbiosis as a mutually beneficial thing. That's only one type, okay, of symbiosis. Mutualism is that one. Again, I'm pretty sure it gets a slide, so hang tight. Then there's commensalism and parasitism. Now, we all know that one's negative. But yeah, you might not use the word in everyday language, but you've certainly heard people say, yeah, we've got a really good symbiosis going, and we work well together, and we work well with each other, something like that. We tend to always use it in a positive light conversationally. That's just not so. So in symbiosis, one species tends to live in or on another species. Another example of how we're misusing it. Certainly you don't live inside of your coworker or on top of them. At least one species, but often 2, uses the other's resources. That's sort of the symbi part of it that we mean. The partner, the symbiont, is either unaffected or harmed by the relationship. I question that bullet point. I might change that in a minute. Because I'm forgetting then. We'll see. Because there is a mutually beneficial one. So, symbiosis is the result of evolution, all right? And what we call coevolution. 2 species growing up very, very close together, close proximity, all right? And they've become dependent on one another. And the classic example is how flowering plants, pardon the pun, but blossomed as insects became more and more prevalent on the surface of the earth. How do we know this? Well, we have fossils, okay, in the rock record, and they show as insect diversity increases, we start to see flowering plant diversity increase. Where's the connection between flying insects and flowering plants, you guys? Yeah, okay. It's a mixture of pollination. It's a function of pollination. Yes, pollination can work with the wind, okay? But that's very, again, just scattershot. But when you've got organisms that like your particular flavor, your particular color, whatever, they're going to land on more of organisms exactly like you. So, or your shape. Not every insect can get into every flower shape to reach the yummy pollen. So we start to see even very specific species tied to very specific species of insects tied to very specific species of plants, and so on and so forth. So this is just a textbook example of coevolution. All right, and certainly insects could have gotten along. Well, I was going to say certainly insects could have gotten along without flowers, but they find that's not true. So they had to go together. So here we go. Because of the food. So pollination, flowering plants evolved to attract pollinating animals. Pollen is male reproductive, and it produces food, which is nectar and pollen itself. We've got the bright colors and the scents of flowers that acted as those attractors. And as I started to tell you a couple minutes ago, it is very specific. I mentioned the shape of the bug or the shape of the insects, either feeding parts. Sometimes with bees, you'll see the pollen is attached to their legs. It just gets on them all over because bees are so fuzzy. But so there's not just the shape of the animal and the shape of the flower, but sometimes even the, as you see here, the chemical content of the ingredients here. Bees look for 30 to 35% sugar in order to make honey and bee bread. All right, to make honey and bee bread. I think bee bread is what they make to feed the queen. But don't quote me on that. So they're going to look for very specific plants that have nectar in that range. They can smell it, probably. But again, they start to associate it with colors and scents as well. All right, so mutualism does have benefits for both. Okay. So that bullet was slightly astray earlier. I thought that didn't sound quite right. So mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both partners benefit. Let's actually go back and change that so I don't, in 3 years when I teach this class again. I won't have the same query. It's either unaffected, either benefit, let's say, either benefits is unaffected or is harmed by the relationship. So back to mutualism. Mutualism is the one where they both benefit. It's mutually beneficial. Might be a good way to remember that. nitrogen-fixing bacteria and legumes. All right, peas, beans, and clover. I had no idea clover was a legume, but again, I was trusting the textbook on that one. So what's going on here is you've got bacteria living in the roots that provide nitrogen to the plant, and the plant in turn provides sugar to the bacteria. All right. So the bacteria eat the sugar, and as part of their waste product, they release nitrogen. And that nitrogen then goes into the soil, and the plants are able to use it as food. So it's mutually beneficial because the bacteria is getting sustenance, and the plant is getting fertilizer or sustenance as well. Commensalism. Commensalism is one member benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. So they're just kind of there. Silverfish and army ants. I don't know that example. It is in your textbook, though, because I would not have made that up. But I do know the tropical trees with smaller plants growing off the bark and branches. Next time you're watching some jungle adventure movie, okay, watch the scenery. And whenever you're in a rainforest or some sort of jungle situation, you don't just have the trees growing. You've got plants in every little nook and cranny possible. All right. And vines often, even up north here. Vines are kind of harmful because they block out the sun. So maybe not the best example, but I was trying to think of an example of plants growing on top of plants up here. We had tried to have grapevines at our old house, and we would get this. Somebody told us it was morning glories. I don't know what it was, but every year we just called it viney twiney. This would cover over the grapes, completely shielding them. But if the grapes weren't there, the morning glories couldn't have grown up and over there. So not a great example of commensalism, but an example of how plants live on other plants. And down south, too, I think they're called the live oaks. You've got oak trees that have a certain kind of moss that always is hanging from the branches. Again. Well, yeah, and actually that's true, too. Just moss, you know. This is much different. This is a big, hangy, drapey. It's very dramatic looking. But, yeah, a great example. And lichens growing off the side, little toadstools, you guys probably call them, growing off the sides of the trunks. Those are probably not detrimental to the tree. So those are great examples of commensalism as well. But yeah, I always mean to check on this silverfish and army ants thing. I'm not sure who benefits who in that one. Parasitism. This one you know already walking in the door. But let's see if they could textbook it up just enough to confuse us, huh? So parasitism is a symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits, I would say greatly, and the other is adversely, negatively affected. All right. The parasite receives nourishment from its host, and the goal of a parasite is to weaken but not kill. It's not in your best interest to kill the organism, because oftentimes these parasites they have mobility issues. They have to get into you in a very particular way, so on and so forth. Ticks are a great example of that. Horrible example of that. Tapeworms, another not so lovely thing to think about.
There's a parasite that will get onto a fish's tongue.
Oh, on its tongue, huh? What's that? Do you remember what that one's called?
No, but I do remember it would replace the fish's tongue.
Wow, that's crazy. I was actually just going to bring up a fish example. You see it a lot in the Great Lakes. Anybody fishing know the parasite we've got in the Great Lakes? So it's the lamprey. It's a type of eel. And they are suckerfish. You might find them if you pull up a fish. This guy attached to the side of it. And you are supposed to kill them on sight, should you ever pick. Don't throw it back in. And it leaves these horrible little marks on the side of the fish, which can get infected and so on and so forth. But, for the time that the lamprey is attached to the fish, it's getting all the food that it needs. But boy, that fish is certainly not feeling real well. So we do see those. They're an invasive species and on top of being a parasite. All right. So again, we're reclassifying what you probably thought as symbiosis, okay, walking in the door. Maybe your high school teachers did a much better job than mine did, okay? But I went through a good chunk of my life thinking that symbiosis was mutually beneficial. But as we see, it really just describes a grouping of relationships with two individuals in them. Some good, some bad, some indifferent. All right, and the last one. Again, talk about not beneficial. Depending on what side of this equation you're on, I suppose. Predation. All right. Consumption of one species by another. Predator and prey, you know those words, hopefully. Okay. Some nice, easy questions on the test, hopefully. Usually we see it animal to animal. Carnivore to herbivore. Sometimes carnivore to carnivore. But as a stereotype, we can say carnivore to herbivore. And, well, we don't really think about it. All right. Herbivore and omnivore, okay? The eating plants is predation. All right. Much easier to sneak up on a shrub than it is to sneak up on a bunny rabbit. But believe it or not, it's the same idea, okay? Plants are organisms. Plants are alive. So when you're eating plants, you are still killing things. Not that parasites aren't crafty, but we tend to see a whole lot more interaction, if you would, in the predator-prey area. Lots of people study it. Very famous. You can't turn on a nature channel without seeing, somebody taking down a wildebeest or whatever. It just is. There's a number of different mechanisms that are in play here. Pursuit or ambush. That should be an or instead of an and, I suppose. But one is hiding and jumping out. One is actively chasing down, of course. And the prey have different mechanisms as well. Some plants look really, really yummy, but end up being quite prickly or quite horrible tasting. And to the extent of even... I'm sorry?
Some plants have spice.
Spice. Yeah. We enjoy it, yeah. It make our eyes water and everything else. Yeah, that is trying to think which way it worked. It was something to put into bird food to keep your squirrels out, because squirrels can taste the pepper, the spice, but birds can't. And I don't know if it was one company or just a suggestion, but I remember seeing it at some point as a way to keep squirrels out of your bird seed. We fed everybody and everything at our house, but some folks are very adamant that they only feed the birds. So random pepper seeds, and possibly even they just coated everything. Don't try it at home, but there was some connection there. So that's some great examples of plant stuff. With critters, one of my favorite are the armadillos. They could roll themselves up. The porcupines, right? That's definitely a put off, I would think. So So yeah, lots of things have evolved over the years. And again, these instincts that we talk about had to have been created at some point. And the beneficial instincts paid off, stayed in the gene pool. All right, this is all still evolution here. And the predator-prey stuff you usually see with the larger-brained organisms. Again, not that your parasites aren't thinking exactly, but this game of Tom and Jerry here takes a bit more thought. You guys still don't know who Tom and Jerry is, right? I got to update my references every so often. All right, so yeah. Usually we see this with the higher level organisms. So let's see. We got slides for what we just talked about. Plant defenses, spines, thorns, tough leaves, waxy leaves, chemicals that taste bad or are just outright toxic, tobacco and marijuana. Most organisms, humans aside again, don't appreciate those odd feelings that you get. Milkweed is another one. If you get milkweed, it can stain your hands pretty bad. And there's only a few insects that can eat it. Butterflies. Can't remember. It might even be a specific butterfly. Is the monarch in milkweed? Okay. And then because that milkweed, we'll just call it some signature, probably a aroma or something that the organisms pick up on. The butterflies then aren't eaten because they eat milkweed. Kind of like how we talk about mercury going up the food chain with the fish. All right, the birds have figured out that we stay away from those guys because they give us a tummy ache. So neat stuff. Neat stuff. Very, very complicated system of interactions on this planet. Very complicated. You might not have thought about it. It's very passive, but shells are a great origination of protection or defense. Okay? A clam that can close itself up when it feels threatened. Even certain squids, nautili, snails, better example, can pull themselves up into their shell. You might not know it, but there's a hard little plate on the back of of many snails that actually closes up as a cap when they pull in the last little bit of them. It's just like a little calcitic plate, and so they get a lid onto their snail shell then. It's called an operculum. Of all the parts I learned over the years, I have no idea why I remember that one. But yeah. Camouflage is a great one. Okay. Again, rather passive, but it is a great mechanism. Burrowing. Yes, burrowing is a great way to have a home that's out of the sun and the weather, but it also provides a great place to hide. Some organisms have chemical defenses. What's a great example of an organism with a chemical defense? Yeah, skunk. Poor skunks. They still haven't learned that smell will not stop a car. It's sad, but it's what they do. And there's other ones. And there's warning colorations. There's the pufferfish expanding is a great example. There's a whole bunch of different things. Things can flush if you have a lot of capillaries near the surface. A lot of organisms can flush their skin with blood, and they'll turn a darker color. Many things. Even herds, living in herds, is a defense mechanism. And we've observed with herd families or herd structures, they will put the younger and the elderly in the middle of the herd for protection. So there's a whole nother level of thinking going on there, not just safety in numbers, but hey, let's put these guys in the middle because they need extra help. So yeah, super neat stuff. All right, this is a different idea. We're not still going through defense mechanisms and symbiosis and stuff like that anymore. Even the defense mechanisms was sort of a different subject. So the idea of a keystone species is very important. And this is something that we're still learning about. So it says, as you can read here, an organism, often a predator, not always, that exerts an influence on the community beyond that expected by its abundance. So it's not an exceptionally common animal by numbers. There's not a whole bunch of them usually. But they play a very vital role for how many of them that there are. So they're vital in determining the nature and structure of the entire ecosystem, which often leaves itself unnoticed until, again, the keystone is messed with. Sometimes you don't know how big these ecosystems really are. And when do we find this out? Is when we do something to the species. Okay, wolves comes up all the dang time as an example of a time we didn't realize the importance of the wolf in the ecosystem. But there's others. Okay, you can have what typically happens, instead of me trying to come up with an actual critter, what typically happens is, again, like it says, we have a predator, all right? And that predator, there might be half a dozen of them in a particular environment, and they more or less, in just living their lives, keep another species population in check by just, again, eating, okay? If for some reason those organisms start causing trouble in other places, again, humans get involved, or something in nature happens that affects those organisms, all right? What we can see then is that, and again, we're back with deer and wolves, but is that population that they were keeping in check starts to overpopulate. And then when they overpopulate, they still need food. So whatever they have been sustaining on suffers a hit as well. And it spirals out of control just by removing sometimes a couple animals. Nature runs a very particular and delicate balance. And you could do the opposite thing. You could accidentally introduce a new species that throws the whole system out of whack. So it's very intricate. And like I said, that's why they very quickly went from food chain to food web. Because it's so many interactions. So here's the example, gray wolf. The wolves were hunted away. We had open season on them. So the elk and deer population rose. Vegetation was overgrazed. Plants disappeared. The insects that also depended on the plants, the pollination, we just talked about that. They suffered a hit as well. Nobody was thinking about the insects a couple minutes ago, right? We were just thinking about the poor deer starving. But there's also a whole number of other organisms that strive on that. So removal of a keystone species in the end affects the entire diversity of that ecosystem. So they reintroduce the wolf population, the deer population starts to go down, the vegetation starts to go back up, You get more mosquitoes to bite you while you're out hunting. Everybody's happy. So related to diversity, we have something called species richness. And it's really a count of the number of different species in a community. As I just said, it's very similar to diversity, biological diversity. Ecosystems do vary, okay? Coral reefs and rainforests are very high. And something like a desert, perhaps you might come to mind, is rather low, okay? Basically speaking, the more niches, the more available roles. Remember, a niche we can think of sort of generically as your role in an ecosystem. So the more complex an ecosystem is, the more roles there are to play, and the more species then can inhabit those roles. Just think of it as companies for you business folks out there, okay? The more involved a company is, the more positions you need, the more people you can support. It's exactly the same thing. And at some point, just like in business, you get too many vice presidents of this and vice presidents of that, and it tends to overload the system then. So we don't want more organisms than you have niches for. All right.